Deus, o salutaris nostre, Dominex Deus, Irinex Deus, Irinex Deus, Deus noster, Dominex est, Angeli,
Hey, so we're doing? Hope you're having a fantastic day. It is Wednesday, September 24th. And tonight I have a very fun one for you guys because, as many of you know, I've been doing this series on Pope Leo, been going over a lot of his doctrinal writings, his different sermons, Angelus messages, letters, and all of that stuff. But I've frequently confessed my ignorance on the way in which the Vatican actually works, the way in which the Curia actually works. So I thought it would be fun to have an episode that's supplementary to this series on Pope Leo, where we actually talk about how the Curia works, how decisions are made, how people are appointed, how documents are released, all that fun stuff on how the Vatican politics actually works. So I decided to bring on my good friend Limbu. He is a reporter for the Catholic Herald. He is their Vatican correspondent. The Vatican press office says you're okay, right, Limbu? Is that the whole deal? They say that you're fine?
That is true. Yes, that's correct. Yes.
So how does that even, if I show up at the Vatican, could I, get this? Like, what does that even mean? Like, how does that work?
So, well, I'll just introduce myself for your crowd. So you guys probably heard my voice before. I was on the Pope Michael stream, a very funny stream, very top banter stream. And now we've moved on to Vatican journalism. See, we've moved so far from Pope Michael to now going to Vatican journalism. How the world works, really. So, but no, to answer your question, if you were to come to the Vatican as a freelance journalist, as yourself, as a media man, it would have to be through the lens of you would have to email the Holy See press office, and then you would have to go through their bureaucratic process. And I know it's quite hard if you're not an established paper, because if you're, let's say, Scholastic Answers, going on the basis of Scholastic Answers, that would mean ultimately you would be essentially, you need to go through the whole vetting process. Not only the vetting process, they would have to interview you, and then you'd have to see, hold on a second, do you have a letter from the ambassador, from the American ambassador to the Holy See? So Brian Birch, do you have a letter from Brian Birch to be an ambassador? That's how hard it is for you as a regular person to be a Vatican correspondent. However, luckily today, myself, I'm in a fortunate position to be a Catholic Herald journalist here today to report on, Vatican things for you guys. So yeah, really, it's quite hard actually, Christian.
Oh, okay. So you basically, you get a cushy job with this newspaper. They send you as the Vatican correspondent. You get to sit around and talk with cardinals all day. Is that kind of like your day-to-day role at the newspaper?
Yes, no, that's exactly the role, really. So it really depends. If you know a cardinal, you know a cardinal. You know a bishop, you know a bishop, really. And we will go into that actually on the member stream, actually. Who we know, actually. And I'm sure your members would like to know the juicy details of who the cardinals are.
We'll be finding out, because I was very interested in learning as I talked to Limbu here and there. I was very interested to learn how actually invested many high-ranking clerics in the church are in the types of discussions that happen in the online sphere. It's very interesting to watch. It's not something that I would expect them to be interested in, but apparently it's actually a pretty big concern for some people in the Vatican. So could you kind of to start this out, could you explain to me, because we have obviously the Pope, we have cardinals, but what's like the superstructure of the Vatican? Like, what are the various different groups within the Vatican, the various different organs of the Vatican? Like, how does that work?
Well, I know you. I think the best way to describe it actually is sort of like American politics or British politics, Anglosphere politics, really, because it's really sort of Ronald Reagan like. It's trickle down economics. And that's really funny, actually. It's very much anti Catholic, but it works because you've got the Pope on the top, and then it trickles down slowly and steadily the types of authority you get. So, for example, you've got the Pope as the head, obviously. And then obviously, you've probably seen on the Instagram the silly posts of, oh, who's head of the Roman Catholic Church? The Pope, the cardinals, the bishops, the abbots, and then the priests and all that. Of course, that's how it works in the usual sense. But usually it's actually the Pope on the top, then it's the dicastery. And then within the dicastery, you've got its inner workings of dicastery. Then you've got your regular bishops. The bishops are below the dicastery. And then it all trickles down to everyone else. If I was going to answer that, Christian.
So what's a dicastery?
So the dicastery is sort of it's the modern name of like the department. So for example, Trump just recently called his new department the War Department. That would be a dicastery, because I mean in Britain, if you've got any British viewers up tonight, our sort of Home Office, our Foreign Office, that would be a dicastery. And what's really interesting about dicasteries is that they very much geographically are split all across Rome. So I think this is really good for your viewers to understand, is that I was in Rome for the past 3 weeks as the quasi-Vatican correspondent for the Catholic Herald. And, I was interviewing all these bishops, cardinals, and what I realized was that they're not all in the Vatican city-state. Instead, they're all across Rome. Because of our history, the Catholic Church's history of the traditional papal states. And for example, when I was interviewing, when I met actually Cardinal Tagle, when I met Archbishop Fortunus, he was actually in like the center of Rome, like totally random from the Vatican. And he was in like the Piazza di Propaganda Fidei, totally out there. Yet that's how the Vatican works. It's totally like a government. It's a whole bureaucracy. And that's, I think, sort of the beautiful thing. With the Holy See, it's a government. You understand that. And then you've got the Vatican. The theology and the state are all intertwined. You cannot separate it like American politics, where it's, separation of church and state. It's all intertwined in the Vatican.
Okay, so you have these dicasteries. So who's in charge of these dicasteries? Do you have the Pope, micromanaging all of these different groups and everything that gets produced by them and all the different acts that they do, or is it more indirect than that?
Well, from my understanding, if there's any Vaticanistas here, they will know that there's 16 dicasteries within the Vatican, and they handle specific sort of areas within the Vatican. So whether that be traditionally the doctrine of the faith, traditionally known as the Holy Office, or whether that be the dicastery evangelization, the dicastery bishops, the dicastery clergy, the dicastery divine worship and sacraments, or the dicastery communications, they are all within here, and they all deal with their specific sort of issues, like any government department would do, any secular government. And what's really interesting, actually, is that they've got their own prefects. Their prefects is like their Secretary of State. So let's take, for example, the American example. The Secretary of State of, for example, Defense in America is Peter Hesketh. Here, for example, let's say who's the prefect of the dicastery of worship and sacraments? Well, that would be Cardinal Arthur Roche. He's the top guy. He's our top guy when it comes to that. So it's sort of like that. And what's really interesting, actually, I think in America you have sort of soft power. But in 2002, I believe it was John Paul II, when he released his motu proprio, was it Predicate Evangelium, where he
Mm,
said all dicasteries are all equal in rank. Because traditionally, from my understanding, the Vatican did have a hierarchy of dicasteries, where it did say, hold on a second, the the dicastery of the Holy Office, the dicastery of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, the CDF, they would hold a higher priority because they're dealing with doctrine, they're dealing with tradition. And, if I want to give some quick, cheeky insight for your viewers here right now, when it came to, for example, the Ecclesia Dei Commission, very famous Latin Mass
yeah.
groups and all that, they actually, the reason why they got suppressed was, of course, it was because of, the Latin Mass issue and tradition. But I believe it was Pope Francis and his top advisors. They saw it as, if we really want equal rank within all dicasteries and all commissions, we can't have the Ecclesia Dei being our top issue. And
Mhm.
that's why they sort of suppressed it. Now, it's not saying that I approve of this, but it's sort of analogy to say that, hold on a second, I can understand where they're coming from because of John Paul II's document. So that's what I would say with that. But you're exactly right. So 16 dicasteries, all like government bodies, all trickling down from Pope Francis with their own prefects.
So I know that at least in the way in which American government works, you have like all of the different departments, like the Department of State, Department of War, et cetera, et cetera. And within each one of these departments, you have the department head, like the secretary of each one of them. But then you also have all of the, assistants, and you have all of the workers, and it ends up being like this massive bureaucracy to where in each president, the heads get changed and, a few of the top guys, but then you have the people who kind of stay over. When it comes to the changing of a new pope, because I know a lot of people have been critical of Pope Leo for this, when it comes to the contents, like the individuals working in the dicastery, the head of the dicasteries, is it kind of like in America where the tops get shifted out and some of the bottoms, or does it remain relatively stable between different pontificates?
Well, I believe it actually is quite stable now. I know Arroyo or Diana Montagna, your more traditional conservatives, would argue otherwise, especially if you looked at what happened to Cardinal Sarah, and Cardinal Muller, what happened to them under Pope Francis. But I truly believe that it is solely down to their term limit, really. I
Yeah.
believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's a 4 to 5 year. The head of a dicastery, either the Pope extends it or they get moved on. So that's really it. And I think the best way to describe a dicastery is, I mean, of course, I said ministry and a department, but
Hmm.
I think unlike a cabinet, they answer directly to one person, a dicastery, and that's the Pope, really. And that makes
Hmm.
them powerful but also fragile because their influence depends upon who runs them and what priorities the Pope sets. So, a really good example here is that Cardinal Tagle, I mean, going back to Cardinal Tagle here, is that his priorities really as the pro prefect, because actually, a big context here, that the head of the dicastery evangelization is actually Pope Leo, but the
Hmm.
pro prefect, so the cardinal in charge of the dicastery, is Cardinal Tagle. So essentially, it's Cardinal Tagle who answers to Pope Leo, and then it's his secretary who answers Cardinal Tagle, then up to the Pope. So it's sort of, you know, they're all answering together, and in that sense, if you look at Cardinal Tagle, actually, he he might be, lots of people, lots of trads online are saying, he answers to, the liberals, he answers to all of that. But in reality, he answers to the Pope, really. So, I mean, to answer that, yeah, that's the really simple issue. Now, if you don't go into soft power, if you don't go into the political issues, that's for the members chat. So, I mean, we'll get to that later, really, Christian.
Yeah. So when it comes to the continuity versus discontinuity, because it feels like I'm kind of getting an idea of how this works. You have like a very unlike the American politics, where all of the heads of each one of the departments get switched out, new cabinet every time you have a new president. It seems like there's a lot more continuity between pontificates. So it seems like it's actually, once you have an agenda being set by a pope, then slowly over time this agenda is put in place, but it can't be instantaneous like in the American system. So how long does this agenda take to be put in place? Like how, like it seems like you're turning like a massive ship. You know, it doesn't seem to be too mutable. So when does the, I guess my question is, when does the Curia become Leonine? Do we have any indications of this from the past?
Well,
Oh, you actually muted yourself.
oh, sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
About that. Well, I don't think there's any way to determine whether or not it's Leonine, but I will say this. It will determine upon who Pope Leo chooses as his new prefects. It's like when Donald Trump, for example, when he chooses his own heads of cabinets. I'm really dumbing this down. I mean, apologies for your viewers here, but I feel like if I dumb it down, it's simpler to understand here. But whenever the term is up, you will fully understand what way Pope Leo is going. For example, I know Cardinal Roche has 1 year left of his head of office of the dicastery of worships and sacraments. Now, let's say, for example, Pope Leo puts an archbishop who's favorable to Latin Mass. We can see, in that sense, we can understand where he's going. However, let's say he puts someone who's in favor of restricting the Latin Mass. That would mean he would obviously, I mean, it sounds pretty dumbed down, really, but that would really mean that his vision is to restrict the Latin Mass. So that's it. But I would say there's a caveat. There's always a caveat here. So the main caveat I actually wanted to bring in is that with Cardinal Roche, I brought Cardinal Roche in already. But we've got to understand, for example, I believe it was Cardinal Robert Serra, he was a prefect under Pope Benedict XVI. Yet, who was his secretary? Who did Pope Benedict approve to be secretary? Well, that would have been Cardinal Arthur Roche, at that time the Bishop of Leeds. So, in that way, we've got to understand that even though the Pope might approve someone to be the dicastery head or the secretary, I think we need to sort of understand that it's not all about appointments. At the end of the day, the Pope is going to choose their top bureaucrat, someone who they know will work the Vatican inner workings. So, I mean, it might be unfortunate he might choose Cardinal Roche, but at the end of the day, he's going to choose someone who's efficient. And I've met Cardinal Roche, and he's quite efficient, actually.
Yeah. So, is it this is interesting. So, really, it seems like there is a consideration that's not purely on the basis of policy, because I feel like us normal people down here below, at the lay level, we're thinking about, who we would choose. We're thinking in the way of like, I think it was, who was the really famously, the very saintly but bad, but was it Adrian V? You know who I'm talking about. In the 13th century, they elected the very saintly pope.
Of course.
Yeah. So it seems like for a lot of us, we would make those sorts of decisions. We would say, oh, well, who's the most based and red-pilled guy I can get at the top of, this dicastery, the most based and red-pilled guy I can get at the top of this dicastery. Let me stack the team sort of thing. But when you're running an institution of 1 billion people, it seems like, unfortunately, the most based and red-pilled guy isn't necessarily the best worker, isn't going to be able to put into effect a lot of these directives. So it seems like you actually have to be a lot more cunning and prudent with those types of decisions. So when will we see from Pope Leo a lot of these dicastery picks? Like, when are they coming down the line? Has there been any decisions thus far when it comes to these sorts of positions?
Well, actually, I have two answers to that. So one of those actually, if you look at his picks of bishops, you can sort of understand who is he choosing for the episcopacy. Who does he want to be his main guys? And the second question is sort of actually, I watched your stream 2 days ago. Actually, surprise, surprise, people who actually like journalism, who work in Vatican journalism, love your content, Christian. So I was watching your stream 2 days ago, and you gave a really good point. A seminarian shouldn't be the hero. I actually really agree with that. And in that sense, if we're going to relate here to this context, that the Vatican, and especially the Pope Leo the 13th, the 14th, will choose in particular. He will choose people who are quiet. In my opinion, what I've understood, he will choose people who are quiet, people who know their jobs, people who are bureaucrats to do what he wants. And that's really interesting because I'll give you a bit of analysis and insight. Pope Francis was a trad. Now that's going to sound crazy to everyone hearing this, but Pope Francis was a trad in the sense of his Curia and his papal household. He ran the papal household and his Curia like a Jesuit. He was like, I need this right now. If you don't do this, we will sack you instantly. He was a man not to mess with, Pope Francis. Exactly. It's a W, really. And that sort of curial politics is what we need back in the Vatican, in my opinion. Now, as a journalist, I don't like to give out my opinion, but I think Pope Francis is quite good in that. But even then, sort of to answer your question, when will we find out? It will probably, because we have lots of old guard cardinals right now from the Francis pontificate still in their dicasteries. So to fully immerse yourself and fully understand the Leonine sort of Curia, it will take a year to 4 years to understand his Curia. And I truly believe his pontificate would last 15 years, Pope Leo's, and then we will fully understand what is going on. It sort of reminds me actually of John Paul II. Now, I'm not old enough, I'm quite young myself, but from my understanding of John Paul II is that he had all of Paul VI's advisors. He even had some of John the 23rd's advisors. He had all of them there, but their terms had never ended, so he didn't really care at first. But when their term ended, he added his guys, and that's what we need to wait for. It's a waiting game, and I think the Pillar is another newspaper. The Pillar talks about this in a great way, in the sense of we need to wait for what his first papal document is going to be, whether that be a motu proprio or an encyclical. I feel like that's the best way to fully dissect and understand Pope Leo, because they've been saying, oh, it's going to be on AI, it's going to be on poverty because of his name, Leo, or it's going to be, actually what I've heard, that's surprising, it's going to be in the liturgy. But I don't actually, I mean, it's all up in the air really with that. So yeah, no, I think that's sort of a good way to look at it. His first document, that's going to come out in a month or two, from my understanding.
Yeah, so you've spoken a lot about the sort of like trickle down effects of making appointments and giving directives. But what are the sort of like trickle up effects? Like how does in the sort of like how do things kind of get from the level of, you know, the diocese and from the level of like a general consciousness among laymen? Like how do those sort of complaints and feedback get from there to, you know, the highest levels of Rome, or is that kind of like an impenetrable wall between the two? Does like nothing we say or do ever kind of affect anything that's going on up there?
Well, I know this might annoy. Actually, no, I'm a big fan of your chat, as you know, and I know this will annoy Vatican II is based. I know he's a great commenter on your streams, but if I'm going to annoy him really quickly to answer that question, there's a Diana Montagna, freelance Holy See Vatican correspondent. She had a really good point with this, in the sense that when she leaked the Traditionis Custodes incident, where actually it wasn't actually Pope Francis who knew about everything. Instead, it was people behind the scenes controlling it, and eventually the Pope got the Pope was the one who signed it off eventually, with even all the bishops who confirmed it. You know, the fact that the Pope gave like the signature on it shows that it is trickling up. The influence goes up, and the bloke, from my understanding, the bloke who designed the whole sort of TC document, he wasn't quite trad. He wasn't even properly Catholic in the sense. He was just doing what he thought was preserving liberalism within the church. Now, not to say, I'm not to divide your viewers here, but it was quite really funny because Dinah Montagna, not only did she expose it, the first person to expose it, and that's why we had that massive bust up 3 months ago, but we also had actually lots of trads who were angry at that. And this is a bit more about the exclusive insides of Vatican journalism, is because Monsignor, I don't know if you know this, Monsignor Nicholas Brooks, who was part of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, he was meant to leave this document in his book, but Dinah Montagna already did. So he had to rush his book just to say, oh, I had it first. And that's what Vatican journalism and all these sort of Vatican leaks are. It's sort of silly and not pretentious in a way, but you know, you want to get your name out, and it is kind of sad in my opinion if it's kind of like that. But you know, in a way, like I said, with this whole Dinah Montagna episode, it all trickles up really, and the Pope will have the final say. I mean, like I said, with the dicastery evangelization of Archbishop Fortunus, it really trickles up. It's Pope Francis who has the final say. And if I'm going to give a cheeky insight to your viewers here, I've recently interviewed Archbishop Fortunus, the secretary, and he said himself, if we want to preserve the Latin Mass, and if you want the Latin Mass to be for everyone, then there needs to be a demand from young people. There needs to be a voice where Pope Leo, Cardinal Tagle, and himself can say, hold on a second, trads are not bad, but trads just want this. And it needs to grow up. And that's my one advice from the interview that's going to be released next week on the Catholic Herald with me and the Archbishop. So that's the one thing I'll say. But, you know, go for it, Christian.
Yeah, I mean, how does, concretely speaking, like how do those sort of concerns reach? Because it seems like there's been a lot of talk about synodality, and a lot of people, they have this weird idea of synodality as if it was like a democratization of the church, which isn't really the case. But is it through like these concrete organs of synodality, like you kind of go to all of these different meetings and express your opinions, and we just have all the people expressing the opinions, and you know, the people with the bad opinions don't show up, and therefore, you know, that's like a surprisingly overwhelming sort of support to these things? Like, is that how it works, like through these concrete organs, or is it through other means?
Well, I have an answer, but unfortunately that's for the members. Unfortunately, that's a bit too juicy. But I will just say this right now, Christian. With the issue of synodality, it's a hot button issue in the Vatican, because the synodality, it's regular magisterium for the Catholic Church. I mean, that's what all the congregations and all the dicasteries see it as. But of course, you've got conservatives, rightfully so, if when they make up a dubia or point out some objectives to whatever synodal way, whether that be the German way or whether that be the Amazonian way, they've of course brought up issues of synodality. Now, what's really interesting here is that it's the way how Pope Leo has recently brought about synodality. So I was going to bring this up later on, but his recent interview with Crux, with Elise and Allen, that was really interesting because, in a way, Pope Leo, I mean, not to go on the trad, not to go on the trad train, obviously, but he brought it in a way, when, especially on the Latin Mass question, he was like, well, you can celebrate the Latin Mass, but if it's in the Vatican II rite, obviously that's a polemic. Yeah. But in a way, that's a synodal polemic because he wants to unite the churches together, but under the zeitgeist of the synodal way. So it's really interesting to look at this as not only as a Vatican journalist myself, but as a layman myself, because I'm a practicing Catholic. So looking at this, it's like, it's crazy to look at this. But no, I will go into much detail on the member stream because this is going to be juicy.
Okay, looking forward to it. So, beside the sort of expressions of synodality, like is there sort of a general awareness? Because I don't know why this thought particularly popped into my head, but I'm sure you're aware of Dr. Ed Fazer and some of his stuff on capital punishment, right?
Yeah, of course, yes.
Yeah, so I mean, his sort of approach is, he writes articles in papers and various journals. I mean, he wrote a book on it. He has discussions on podcasts like that. That's sort of the way of getting out the sort of message of his concerns with the catechism change, for example. Is that sort of approach, that sort of way of going about it, is that in the realm of that trickle up towards having people who actually not that Dr. Fazer doesn't matter, but the people who are actually the movers and shakers, those people, is that a sort of effective way, or is it kind of just throwing stuff out there and there's not really going to be any sort of return on investment?
I would agree with you. Actually, I think it does trickle up. I mean, it's sort of. I was very fortunate because I used to work in government. I used to work in Parliament, and so our Parliament is like essentially the Congress. I used to be. What do you Americans call it? A staffer on the Hill.
I mean, like a congressional aide.
Yes, a congressional aide. Yes, that's the equivalent. And what's really interesting is that we congressional aides, we recognize what people are saying on Twitter, Instagram. Like, for example, if I see like a funny based in red pilled meme, I'm like, haha, look at this, and I'll send it to my boss. That's how stuff works up. And 100%, I think it works in the Vatican. So, for example, let's say, your regular guy in the Apostolic Signatura, so the head of the canon law in the Vatican, let's say, for example, he sees a funny meme about Cardinal Burke and giving his interpretation, whatever it is, he will see that meme. He will see that comment on Twitter, and then he will either write that on a paper, he'll either write that on a daily comms, or he'll bring it up in a meeting. And this goes with Dr. Ed, actually, Dr. Ed Fesser, really, because people like those who make books, who actually write theological studies, who can actually critique the magisterium and actually influence magisterium, those topics and those sort of books will do great things because they'll actually say, hold on a second, we actually didn't consider this. In a way, it's actually helping them out because they don't need to do the work, and instead it's writers like Dr. Ed, it's writers like you, Christian, for example, who are influencing magisterium and influencing the Curia.
Interesting. I mean, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And there's also, I think, despite the present, because obviously a lot of our, influences are pretty small at present, but kind of looking into the future, like having a sort of future-oriented outlook. Because I don't think I know we're talking a lot about the Leonine papacy and how causes and effects work in the Leonine papacy, the people in the Curia. Under Pope Leo, et cetera, but having a future-oriented bend, looking towards 30, 40, 50 years from now, how does a sort of long-term influence look when it comes to the church?
Sorry, could you repeat that question? You kind of cut out for me. Apologies.
Oh yeah, basically like how presently when it comes to the Leonine papacy, obviously, a lot of us are very young. Our audiences are very young, and the influence is quite limited to that specific age group. But looking forward, looking into the future under, a Pope John the 24th or a Pope Pius the 13th, Pope Leo the 15th, however it looks in the future, how does that sort of long-term planning work? If you get what I'm saying.
I get what you kind of actually mean, but in a way, I don't, because in the Vatican, what they do is they don't actually plan that well ahead. Because I was going to foolishly say to you actually that the Vatican plan things in ahead, but they don't plan ahead to thousands. For example, I'm going to give you some insight, and I'm going to give your members some insights here. And luckily, they don't need to pay. Here. So with you might have seen on the news the whole LGBT pilgrimage to the St. Peter's. Now, Leo didn't plan that. That was planned by
Yeah.
Pope Francis donkey years ago. That was planned like a year ago. But unfortunately, the late Pope Francis died. And I don't think Pope Leo is going to say and kick a fuss about, hold on a second, I don't want this to happen. Sure, I can understand. I can feel the trads coming at me right now. But as a simple journalist, what I can simply say is they do prepare things. And I don't think, especially on the issue of the LGBT St. Peter's pilgrimage, I don't think His Holiness gives that much. Sure, there's rumors of, sure, he approved of it and whatnot. But if I'm going to be frank and honest, as a conservative traditionalist myself, I don't think that His Holiness is going to care. He's got many things to deal with anyway. So that's, in a way, if I'm going to be quite scummy about it, not half answer it, there's a halfway point to it. He's obviously prepared to it, but they've not prepared that long with Curia.
Hmm. But how about like I guess a more indirect way, like where do the type of people who actually have direct influence, like where do they come from? Like what are the type of people who actually enter into that type of service and can be in, like where is like the guy who's going to be moving and shaking 50 years from now? Where is he right now?
Well, that person who's there could be either of us, really. I think what's a really interesting thing, especially, I'm going to mention the word. I'm not Anthony. I'm not from Avoiding Babylon. I'm going to mention the word, the Second Vatican Council. With the Second Vatican Council, actually, what's really interesting is that we've seen in the Curia and the dicasteries that it's actually lots of lay people now are moving into the dicastery, and they're actually making a massive difference within our theology and actually determining our cardinals and bishops' diaries, really. So I think, to put it really simply, best example I can give you is Cardinal Roche's secretary is a priest, but Cardinal Tagle's secretary is a laywoman, not even a nun. So it's really interesting that we have this sort of dichotomy here, that it's either nun or priest. So it can be any of you guys watching this stream. Not to big you guys up, obviously, but it could be anyone who applies for a job in the Vatican, who applies on the online portal to say, hey, I want a job in the Vatican, the dicastery. It's literally that. It's quite transparent now from compared some years ago, really.
Yeah. Put your LinkedIn link right here. Put all your experience. That's actually kind of crazy. I never really thought about. I'm glad you brought that up because I've never really thought about the fact that most likely in the next 30, 40, 50 years, we're probably going to see a shift to a lot more lay positions within the Curia. But right now, what is I'm just curious, what is the average profile of a layman in one of these positions?
Well, I'm trying to figure that out myself, because I'm going back to Rome for the Summorum Pontificum, a pilgrimage where I'll be meeting more cardinals and bishops and dicastery heads. And I think it's really interesting. From my understanding, from what I saw from the Vatican actually was that, sure, there are more priests, there are more nuns actually, but there is creeping amount of lay people in there. And I'll tell you this, it's a far cry from the Vatican. If you saw this before 1950s, a security guard in the Vatican who's a layman, nothing to do with the Catholic faith, that's a far cry out. But now we see laymen who are security guards. Now that might not sound big, But from my understanding and from my understanding of Vatican history, that the fact that we have laymen who are security guards, they don't even need to be Catholic anymore. The fact that we have those sort of men who are security guards for the dicastery heads, the security heads of any dicastery or the Vatican. It's interesting, really, that anyone could be a sort of a head of a dicastery, not head of a dicastery, sorry, but an influencer or a mover, a shaker per se. It's really interesting.
What
I mean,
people, like, what are their backgrounds? I mean, are they theologians? Like, what are they doing? Like, what are they doing in their home country to just kind of all of a sudden be like, oh, I guess I'm going to apply to to work in the Curia? Like, what is their background? What are they doing? Like, how do they get there? Like, that's very fascinating to me.
well, I will give you an insight with this, actually. I mean, this should be for members only, but I'll tell you this right now. That most Curia workers are actually priests, monks who are in Rome, stationed in Rome, who've got nothing better to do. So, for example, I've got a friend who's a Franciscan, and he's in Rome, and he's part of the general Curia in Rome, and yet he works in part one of the pontifical commissions. Now, he applied for it for the. I don't know if you have this word in America, but he applied for this word for the crack, for the fun of it, and he still got the job. So it's literally right time, right person. It's sort of like any job, really, any government job. That's how I see it as. So,
So I mean, it's like a networking thing. Like, you have these random laymen who happen to have skills that would be desirable, and they know the right people, and then therefore they kind of end up like working in one of these dicasteries.
yes, exactly. I would agree with that. Yeah, I would agree with that assertion, actually, Christian, because what's really interesting is that when we look at our dicasteries, is that these are priests, bishops, especially secretaries. These are people we don't know. These people, these bishops, these priests are groomed essentially for their roles. They're groomed to be nuncios. They're groomed to be theologians. They're groomed to understand dogmatic theology. They're groomed to understand certain key components of our faith. And I would say that's the most beautiful thing about our faith, and especially the bureaucracy of the church. Now, I'm not a big fan of bureaucracy, but it's the fact that our bureaucracy and our church can actually break down certain elements of our faith and actually defend it, because we've got top guys who can defend it in a way where they're experts in a dicastery position. I think it shows that, the Catholic Church is prepared for the end time. The Catholic Church is prepared to defeat whatever it comes at. So, in a way, it's sort of like that, really.
So when it comes to the hiring appointment process, because I assumed like that you kind of blew my mind there with the layman comment, but I guess and you can completely correct me if I'm wrong here, but the way that I assumed it worked within dicasteries are that you had the dicastery head, you had the guy who's maybe in charge of a department within the dicastery, and this guy, they give roles out by appointment. So it's, they know a guy back home, let's say they were a bishop somewhere, or maybe they were, in a diocese, and they had a guy they knew in the diocese. He was really good for this. And, I guess you just call him and be like, hey, you want the role? So I always assumed everything was by appointment. So there's actually like people applying for these jobs, like that's a thing that happens. How common is that? Is that universal? Like, are there people out there like applying for the DDF and such?
Well, you're half right and you're half wrong, actually, in the sense that there are people applying. There are people who say, bit of the old boy tactics of, hey mate, can you give me a job? I'll be great for this job. The classic old boy tactics. But then in the same turn, there are these people who've actually will apply for these jobs, who will actually email into the dicastery, and whatever secret portal there is, they will apply for these jobs. And you mentioned actually funny bishops. the one thing I will say with that is that bishops will not apply because due to their episcopal authority, they won't. If they're under an archbishop or a bishop secretary or a prefect cardinal, their role will lessen, their authority will be lessened, if you know what I mean. And it's sort of, in a way, is they wouldn't really want that compared to their like diocese sort of authority, really.
This is very interesting. But I want to move on to a few of the chat questions, and then we gotta get on over to the members only section, where we will be continuing to go into some of the juicier details. I guess I'll put it like that.
Of course,
some
of
of the stuff
course.
you told me about conversations with some cardinals about interesting topics. But Walker, thank you for the super chat. Get this red coat off stream. True.
Sorry, can I just respond to that? Get this red coat off stream. I would actually, if I'm going to be quite controversial here, I think it's very traditionalist to be a red coat, God King country, you know, traditional Jacobites, you know. I mean, that's what I'll say, but I'll let your members be what they want to do.
Yeah, I just think that's Cole.
Yeah,
I think it's Cole. I think it's wrong, but you know, that's just me. So Servus Veritatis, he said, "How do you get into Vatican journalism? Both my parents were journalists, so it interests me. Please pray for my friend Will, who died in a truck accident." So how do people get into Vatican journalism? We already talked about, you know, there's 500 applications going into the Vatican the Vatican application portal as we speak right now. But if somebody wanted to get into Vatican journalism, like, how does that work?
Well, I just want to first say I'll pray for your friend Will. Obviously, that's tragedy that he died in a truck accident. But with Vatican journalism, there are obviously papers, institutions that you can apply to get a job. And now I know the job word is kind of scary for most of you people watching the stream, but I mean, I think ultimately you can start it yourself. I mean, it's really funny. I know lots of top Vatican journalists who started from a blog or a Substack, and then they'll get noticed by editors. Fortunately, I had the grasp. I knew some certain people to get into the position I am for the Vatican Catholic Herald position as a journalist and as a contributor for the Catholic Herald. And I'll always report on Vatican news. I'll always report on the top news that we see today in the Catholic world, really.
Yeah, I mean that's awesome. I tend to agree. I guess from my perspective is kind of getting started in something that's not necessarily super official, and then networking a lot. Like, and a lot of these people are surprisingly accessible, much more accessible than you would think. Does the Pope actually know what he's doing when selecting a random bishop in a place he doesn't know? This is a question that I have because, you know, like if I had to, you know, imagine if the president had to appoint like the mayor of every single town in America. Like I would think that it would be a very difficult task. It would have to be a lot of mediated knowledge. I mean, that's not a perfect analogy. Every mayor, actually, let me see how many bishops are there? A few thousand in the world.
Yeah, there's a few thousand. Yeah.
Okay, how many bishops in the world? 5,500. Wow, there's 5,500 Catholic bishops, 900 Anglican, and 941 Orthodox bishops. It's kind of crazy. Okay, so how many? Let me see this now. How many counties are in America?
There's a lot of counties.
Like the Pope has to. That's basically like if the president had to appoint every single county commissioner in the entirety of the United States. That would be like a crazy job to have to do. So I mean, I get it. But anyways. Yeah, you can continue on with your answer. Sorry for yapping.
Well, oh no, I quite enjoyed the yap. Before I answer Dan 827's question, someone just said I knew some certain people. Well, commas, and did they happen to have shekels or funny hats? Well, let me answer that really quickly. No, they did not have any shekels or funny hats. I worked hard for my job. I know it sounds really funny saying this, but I mean, working in Parliament, you've got to know the right people. Unfortunately, there, I would say this: in whatever government job you work in, there are scumbags, and you need to avoid those scumbags, really. And I was quite fortunate. I knew the right people, the right Catholic people, in the right spots. So yeah. But now I'll answer Dan's question. Does the Pope actually know what he's doing when selecting random bishops? Well, what's really interesting, we know that uh, Cardinal Prevost, aka our Pope now, he was the head of the dicastery of bishops. He was essentially the one who had the main choosing points of choosing who the new bishops were. And what's really interesting, actually, is that it's currently vacant, the role, the head of the dicastery. And aka, so that would mean in this situation, Pope Leo is the head of it. So when Pope Leo makes appointments of, for example, liberal bishops, not to defame His Holiness, obviously, but it is kind of concerning in my opinion, because it's not only the commission who are choosing, and it's not. So I think we understand. Not only is it the dicastery who has the final say, but the first say is the important bit. It's the apostolic nuncio. So, for example, you Americans will know recently that the archdiocese of the archdiocese, which one's it? New Orleans, isn't it? They have a new bishop, and
Yeah.
that would have been the apostolic nuncio. That's your nuncio actually doing a secret report, looking at all the priests or the current bishops, the suffragan or auxiliary bishops, to say, hold on a second, I'm going to choose this guy to be the new bishop of New Orleans. So it's, in a way, it's trickled up, like we were previously talking about. So in that sense, it's up, and then after that, it's bunch of old guard bishops saying, yeah, he'll be good, he'll be bad. And then it's the Pope who had the final say. And what's really interesting, and I'm going to say this in confidence, I know Pope Leo has rejected few candidates to be bishops because of how progressive they were. And he knew that they were going to be pretty bad. So he obviously knows, but then when he chooses a liberal candidate anyways, it's going to cause problems. So I mean, it's the way how the world works, unfortunately. I mean, he does choose, but it's a much more difficult situation than we know. So
yeah, I mean, that would kind of, I guess, to bring it back to American politics so we can get the equivalent. The president has to choose all of the mayors of the entirety of America, which I just looked it up. It's actually kind of a comparable number-ish. And actually, they were just going off of reports which were given to them by, like, the governor of the state. And the governor of the state was also appointed by the president, like, 25 years ago. It's like it's such a convoluted system, but I actually do very much like sympathize with how difficult a lot of these decisions are, because also you have the president is doing like crazy amounts of other stuff and can't really keep up on all of it. So I can imagine this is especially the case with St. John Paul II. Is a lot of people were criticizing him near the end of his pontificate for some of the decisions he made for episcopal choices. But it's like, well, what do you expect? I mean, I could see when you become pope, you kind of grew up into the hierarchy with a lot of these people already there. So you kind of know the people when you enter. But what about, like 20, 25, 30 years later when you have an especially long pontificate? I mean, all the people you knew are dead now, and it's just whole new crop of people who were seminarians when you became pope. So yeah, I mean, it's incredible for me. It seems like that would be one of the most incredibly difficult parts of the job, would be choosing bishops, especially with the sort of multi-layered nature of a lot of the information you're getting and a lot of the churches that you're hearing from. But that's an awesome question. Random Catholic, he says, Didn't we fight a whole war 250 years ago so I wouldn't have to listen to posh British accents with all the gossip? True. McChicken Money, also what's up Limbo from Campbell. Yeah, he's on his phone. Okay. Just trying to see if there's any other questions I want to answer before we move over to the member-only stream.
Yeah, no, I mean, of course, I mean, whatever you need to do for your stream, and unfortunately, Pete B was banned from the comments, and poor guy. It's actually quite great to look at the StreamYard because I can see Pete B was banned. It's quite funny.
Look, who banned them? I don't know. We'll never know. But anyways, we have like 4 or 5 minutes till we move over. So do you want to give like your final pitch? Tell everybody about where they can find more from you, how they can ask you questions, how they can send little messages through, the link that I posted in the description below.
Well, I'm a quite open guy. You can message me on Twitter, really. I mean, I'm
No,
over.
you can tell them to send the message with your buy the coffee thing so they can do that.
Oh yes, of course. Oh yeah, buy me a coffee. Obviously, donate. I'm chilling here, bit of shackles once in a while. I've got to do that once in a while. So buy me a coffee, donate to me, and the private members stream. If you want some juicy answers from me, you ought to pay a bit extra for that. You know what I mean? But obviously, if you want to read my work, my daily news reporting work, go on the Catholic Herald. You'll find my byline there. My 2 recent articles are recently published there in the Catholic Herald. And if I'm going to be honest, I've completely forgot it. So let me just pull it up. My recent 2 bylines to the Catholic Herald. But, if I can explain the Catholic Herald a bit more, what's really interesting with the Catholic Herald is that you've seen in America, you've got the Arlington Herald, the Sacramento Catholic Herald. But, the Catholic Herald started in 1888 in London. And ever since then, we've had top people writing, contributing for us. We've had Tolkien write for us. We've had Evelyn Waugh. We've had Hilaire Belloc. We've had G.K. Chesterton write for us. Good, sound men and women from the years who've written for the Catholic Herald. And now I'm here, just an unknown, lovely layman who just wants to put out good work to uphold the faith and uphold the news. And as we may know, today is the feast day of Our Lady of Walsingham. And I've written a lovely article on the Diocese of Westminster's pilgrimage to the shrine. And if you've been keeping up with the news, it's the second hearing of Cardinal Biecci's a trial of the century, so-called. So you can. So those are my 2 articles of Catholic Herald that's been done today. I've done more, but those 2 are under my byline. So, I mean, like I said, what Wagner said, buy me a coffee or buy me a pint if you want to be more British. So, yeah, that's the best way I can put it, really, chaps.
Yeah, that's awesome. I gifted some memberships because some people were saying that they don't have jobs. So, and I figured I just gifted like 10 memberships. So, this one's on me, boys. This one's on me. So this is the last question I guess I'll answer before we move over. Does the Pope meeting certain people matter?
100% does matter. And actually, no, I'm sorry. I might sound like a massive scumbag saying
matter, do they mean? They basically mean by matter, like, does the Pope meeting certain people kind of like reveal his cards to the world? Like, when he meets with Cardinal Burke, does that mean he like completely agrees with Cardinal Burke? When he meets with James Martin, like, what do these things like indicate?
No, I mean, if you're going to word it like that, no, it doesn't really matter because, for example, on Monday, the Pope met with the president of Germany. The president of Germany is a left-winger. That doesn't really matter. I mean, the Pope's not agreeing with him on that matter. But at the same time, he also met on that day Cardinal Sarah, big top dog. So, I mean, in a way, it does matter, but in a way, it doesn't matter. And I'm going to get into the juicy things later on tonight. So, buy me a coffee and also super donate to Christian Wagner. So it'll work out.
Yeah, we're gifting 5 million memberships. Don't worry about it, guys. Okay, thank you everybody for tuning into this. I hope this was helpful. I learned a lot of fascinating things today. I'll be back. Obviously, we're moving over to the whole after show, and for the members only, you can join in the join button below. But on Friday, I'm thinking I'm going to go ahead with my next installment, my Pope Leo series. Go over all the documents that I missed. I know. I haven't been doing much like strict theology stuff recently. I'm going to get back into that next week. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 8 p.m. With a 9 p.m. Members only after show. Also, if you're a patron, if you go to patreon.com/MilitanThomas, you can sign up to be a patron and you get access to the members only streams and more as well. But yes, I will be streaming now 3 days a week with a Saturday edited video if Unius Initiative, gets on that. So definitely tune in those nights live to see me. I love hanging out with you guys. So that's all that I have for you. And as always, God bless.